The swing state in focus today is Wisconsin, also popularly known as America's Dairy Land. We dive into what makes Wisconsin a crucial battleground state. Here's a report.
Wisconsin is once again at the center of America's electoral map, as a key swing state that could ultimately decide the 2024 presidential election. With a history of switching between parties in recent years, Wisconsin has been one of the most unpredictable states in the country. After going red in 2016, it swung back to blue in 2020 with a very slim margin, making it a crucial target for both candidates in this tight race. Let's take a closer look at Wisconsin's role in this year's election. Wisconsin is home to about 5.9 million people. It carries 10 electoral votes, a state that could swing the results in a close contest. As a politically divided state, Wisconsin has become a battleground, where both parties are fighting for every last vote. In 2020, President Biden won Wisconsin by a mere 0.6%, largely thanks to strong support in cities like Milwaukee and Madison. This narrow win underlined the state's importance, as even a slight shift in voter turnout could easily change the outcome. With diverse communities and a mix of liberal and conservative strongholds, Wisconsin remains a political toss-up. The 2020 election in Wisconsin was one of the most closely watched in the country. Biden's victory here marked a return to Democratic control after the state had gone to Trump in 2016. Biden's win relied heavily on urban and suburban turnout, especially among young and diverse voters in Milwaukee. Biden proved to be the most popular among the African American, Latino, and Hispanic community. Meanwhile, rural areas and small towns continued to back Trump, highlighting a sharp urban-rural divide that has become characteristic of Wisconsin's politics. The close results demonstrates how every vote counts here, with the state's mix of liberal and conservative bases leaving no clear favorite. Now, as we approach 2024 polls, Wisconsin is once again in the spotlight. Both Democrats and Republicans are investing heavily to win, and yet again there are no clear favorites, as polls show both Trump and Harris tied at 48%. When it comes to the critical voter concerns, this is what the numbers tell us. Once again, economy, immigration, and reproductive rights top the list of voter concerns. And when it comes to the economy and immigration, it is Donald Trump who seems to have a slight advantage. When it comes to reproductive rights, it's Harris who has bagged 54% of the voter support. Apart from these, the conflict in West Asia has emerged as a key concern for voters, and this is where Trump seems to have wider support as well. With many voters still undecided, both campaigns are ramping up efforts to connect with swing voters, who could be the ones to tip the balance. The polls reflect a small edge for the Republican nominee, but it's within the margin of error, and with high voter engagement expected, anything is possible. Will Wisconsin maintain its blue streak from 2020, or could it turn to the Republican column, as it did in 2016? This state remains one of the most crucial contests to watch out for. Bureau Report WION, World is One.
We are now being joined by Professor Lincoln Mitchell from Columbia University's School of International and Public Affairs, SIPA. He's joining us live from Wisconsin. Thank you so much for joining us on WION this morning. Professor Mitchell, with both sides claiming that misinformation is impacting the election, how significant do you think these narratives are, especially as they're being amplified on social media on the one hand? And are we seeing a deliberate strategy perhaps in how this information is being designed and circulated?
Yes, I think it is having an impact. And we have to be really careful about both sides here, because what we're seeing from a Harris campaign in the Democratic Party is what you would see in any kind of pre-Trump Democratic or Republican campaign, which is the candidate trying to put the best face on her accomplishments and her promises. And, some things that we might call, exaggerating, but not outright lying or engaging in disinformation. From the Republican side, we're seeing something very different. We're hearing stories that there will be massive vote fraud. There's no evidence of that. We're hearing just things about data, statistics that are being cited. I mean, just to give you an example, I was talking to a voter yesterday, a Trump supporter, who told me that he was supporting Trump because the Democrats were going to make him buy an electric car, which is, of course, not true. They're just going to, they're structuring some incentives to encourage people. And then he told me that the German economy was strong because Germany wasn't on the euro. And I tried to say, well, actually, Germany is on the euro. If you maybe if you've been to Germany, or read about that, you might know that. But that's all Republican disinformation, which is really trickling down to voters and informing some of their vote choices.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, it's misinformation, one thing, and then you have the gaffe from the President of the United States, calling supporters of Donald Trump garbage, and then Mark Cuban, who's supposed to be a surrogate of Kamala Harris, talks about how women supporting Trump aren't strong, or there aren't any strong women around him. Are these issues, and the ones that you mentioned, of course, on the part of Trump supporters, are they affecting undecided voters in any way?
Well, I'm not sure about that. I mean, the Biden garbage comment, I think we'd all agree was an unfortunate thing he said. Of course, Trump has called Harris supporters garbage for months, weeks now, and enemies of the people. So, we have to be careful here about saying that the Democrats are really way out of line here. It was nonetheless a stupid thing to say. You should never describe anybody as garbage, and it's not a nice thing to say. I don't know that that's swinging persuadable voters. I think that those things are kind of resonating with the base. You talk about how competitive a state like Wisconsin is, but when I talk to people on the Democratic Party campaign side, what they frequently tell me is that their biggest fight is between voters who are not debating between Kamala Harris and Donald Trump, but colloquially what they say is Kamala and the couch, meaning, do I get out and vote for Kamala Harris or do I stay home? And that's where the misinformation can have an impact, because you hear voters saying, look, they're both terrible, they're both the same. And that's a Republican misinformation campaign to discourage voters, which is an age-old political trick. I think the difference this year is it's really involving just radically different degrees of disinformation.
Very interesting. And looking at early voting, what trends are we seeing so far compared to past election cycles? And is there anything notably different this time around? For example, what factors might influence these trends, and what could they mean for the final turnout on Election Day?
The biggest factor, of course, influencing all trends of early voting everywhere in the United States is COVID. We had COVID in 2020. We don't this year. And I'm looking at, I just happened to look at the data for San Francisco, which was a city that had very strong COVID restrictions and also very strong anti-Trump. And in 2020, that many people voted early than this year. So I think a lot of people are saying, you know what, I can go back to the polls. I'm going to do that. I'm hesitant to put too much stock in early voting data because we just don't have enough cases to really say something. The one thing to keep in mind, though, is that if you are on the campaign side, you want your voters to vote early because it makes less work for you in the last 48 hours, and you can concentrate on getting the tougher people, the people who really might not vote, out to vote. And early vote is money in the bank. That's how smart campaigns, whether Democrat or Republican, see that. But, if we point out that, for example, it looks like in general, more women are voting early, that might be interpreted as a sign for Harris, or it might just mean the men will vote on Election Day. More white people in some southern states, particularly Georgia, are voting early, but African Americans will frequently vote, they might be voting later. So, I'm really, at this point, I'm looking much more closely at the polling data than I am at the early voting data.
That's really interesting. Professor Mitchell, and since you're studying that polling data, can you tell us more about the trends that you're seeing? You did talk about, the gender gap, but also, does it matter if an individual is voting on a single issue like gun control or the economy, healthcare and whatnot, and someone who's just generally going to the polls?
Well, you have a huge number, probably the majority of the voters in America knew 6 months ago who they were voting for because they either love Trump or hate Trump or, something like that.
Yeah.
So that's the biggest chunk of voters. Many people fit that description. The biggest single issue vote I see this year. Now, remember, a single issue that brings voters out to vote for the party they would vote for anyway is different than one that might make somebody cross a party line. And the biggest issue I see there is reproductive freedom, where a lot of women, now younger women are voting Democratic in very heavy numbers, much more so than younger men. But that's a kind of younger people, younger women are generally a Democratic voting bloc. But among older women, you're seeing something, which is older women who traditionally voting Republican are not comfortable with the Dobbs decision, are not comfortable with a national abortion ban, and you'll see many of them cross over and vote for Harris. So if you want to isolate this to a single issue, a real substantive issue that could really make a difference in terms of having voters change their mind, for me, it's very much reproductive freedom, and that's a good issue for Kamala Harris.
And in your opinion, do you think that, we continuously think about 2022 and how the polls promised this red wave and whatnot. And then in 2022, an extent as well, polls weren't very accurate. You can maybe attribute that to COVID. How do you see the reliability of polls at this point?
Well, it's a question of what we're asking polls to do. I think polls right now are telling us some very useful things about the electorate. For example, the polls are telling us that there is something of almost a mini realignment going on right now, where white people are moving more towards the Democratic Party than in previous cycles, primarily educated white people, college educated white people. And there is some hemorrhaging of support among African Americans, which used to be, 90%, and maybe they'll be, 82% for Kamala Harris this year. So I suspect the polls are telling us useful information there. But if you want to look at the horse race, who's going to win Wisconsin, who's going to win Michigan, what the polls have told us all along, if you look closely at the polls, is that it's going to be very close. They haven't told us anything more than that. So if you see a poll, this morning that says Harris up by 1 point in Pennsylvania or Trump up by 1 point in Georgia, what that tells you is it's a tie. And it's very close, which we knew before we started polling anyway. So I think in the close states, I don't think the polls are predicting who's going to win. They're predicting it's going to be close, and I suspect they'll be right about that.
And Professor Mitchell, my final question is, with Wisconsin being such a critical swing state in the election, what issues are resonating more with voters there in that state?
Well, a handful of issues are resonating with voters here, and they're the major issues. For a lot of people, immigration, the border crisis. Now, Wisconsin is a state with very few immigrants, so it's kind of an odd thing, but it's gotten inside people's heads. I see a lot of concern about crime. Again, I'm in a small city called Janesville, Wisconsin, which is a very safe city, but you still see the people's lawn signs here will say things that the Trump campaign for Trump that says, Kamala crime, Trump safe. Now, I don't know what they have against verbs, but the message there is very clear. Here, also, reproductive freedom for women voters. The Democratic Party has to do well among white women here. This is a state where it's 90+% white, so you can't count on people of color to put you over the top. But another piece of this that is overlooked, but in the states, the three blue wall states, as they're called, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, is the labor movement. And unions are coming out pretty strong in this state and Michigan and Pennsylvania for Harris. For example, the United Auto Workers, one of the oldest and most powerful industrial workers in the country, is strongly for Harris. The International Brotherhood of Electric Workers, the IBEW, Harris just did a rally here in Janesville with them. So labor, now in these states, those are heavily white, working class people. And if those folks can come over and vote for Harris, I think she'll be fine. And if they vote like the rest of the white working class people who aren't in labor unions, it'll be difficult for her.
Yeah, that's very true. I remember during the Occupy Wall Street movement, I was covering Madison, Wisconsin, and the labor unions really showed up against Scott Walker back then. Professor, it was a pleasure speaking to you. Thank you so much for joining us on WION.
My pleasure. Thank you.